Wow, New Year's Eve episode, recording on New Year's Eve. And who better to join me for the New Year's Eve episode than Shawn and Tyler from Emergence? Obviously, you guys have been on the show many times. This is a returning thing, although not for a while. So this is nice to have you back on. Um, Albeit our subject matter, I would prefer to be, a little bit different. But before we jump into all of that, because we are going to get into some meaty topics today, hello to you both. Shawn, what's been going on? It's been a while since you've been on, so catch me up a little bit.
I was just thinking about how long it's been, reminiscing, if you will, because it feels like we're both getting a little longer in the tooth and aging year by year here, which is a good thing. It means that we're going around the globe and around the sun a few more times. But obviously, I'm always excited to chat with you. We here at Emergence have been in the midst of planning the next Sport Movement Skill Conference, the 2025 Sport Movement Skill Conference. We're not quite ready to announce that, save the date, and let the cat out of the bag on some of those things. But that's really what's been going on over here on Emergence's end. We'll be able to announce that here probably shortly after the new year. But we got a few exciting things for the community, and I know I speak for Tyler and the team at Emergence in saying that some of these things have been in the works for quite some time. So we're excited to put that out to the community, but of course, we're right at the tail end of the National Football League season as well. So I'm up to my ears in my all movement team and my mover of the year analysis, which I know we've gotten on to chat about in the past, and we may have to do that again when I'm able to release that. But that's what's been going on here over on my shoulders, and Tyler has plenty to talk about as well himself, I'm sure.
Well, honestly, life is just really good right now. I'm very blessed and very appreciative for the time that I have. As you both know, I've recently completed my doctorate. Well, actually defended and completed it back in June, but officially walked and just received my diploma. So it feels official now, but I've gotten a lot of time back to spend with the kids, and obviously coming on the back end of the holidays, I've spent a lot of time laughing and eating good food and swimming and hanging out with them. So it's been really good as of late. And as Shawn mentioned, things are rolling along smoothly here for Emergence, and I'm excited to be on with you here today. I did finally get a chance to meet you in person, which was absolutely epic whenever I was over there last month. So that was a blast, and I appreciate you taking the time that you did. And so I'm excited to be on today and to dive in with you.
Yes, they were some very enjoyable pale ales that you introduced me to, because you guys do produce some excellent pale ales, albeit they are way too strong. And
That's
I'm not
true.
going to
That
say
is that is
anything more
true.
about the evening.
It was a good evening, but I certainly was getting tired towards the end, and we were with a couple of other gents that are a little younger than you and I think they were ready to keep going, and I was falling asleep at the table. So it was a fun night.
That is true. That is very true. Yeah, you were on a wild whirlwind tour, weren't you? You'd literally been in a week and then out again, and yeah, your feet didn't even touch the ground. That's probably an entirely different podcast. So one of the things I just wanted to just start with is reflecting on this last year. One of the things that feels to me is that I think the ecological community, I think, is really growing. You've got a lot of people over there, and you've got Javi who's doing a brilliant job with his podcast, and I was, fortunate enough to feature on there. And there's a lot of interest from a lot of different walks of life, lots of people, doing some very exciting things. And more and more interest. My own community of learning, the guild is growing all the time, and lots of more people coming in interesting now. So that's now the Guild of Ecological Explorers, I'm calling it now. It goes through many manifestations. But it's interesting because people are coming in, they're curious, they're interested, they've got some, they want to find out different things, and it's just all these different applications. And the really exciting thing for me is hearing people's stories about the impact it's having, not just on them, but also on the people they work with, the performances that are taking place, and all that sort of stuff. And it feels to me that that interest is really, really growing. But then what's interesting about that is that, that then, needless to say, I think has generated some I think there's some people are threatened by that. I think if you are somebody who, for example, have a research background, advocating for different kind of a different approach from a different theoretical standpoint, if you're somebody who has built a consultancy business based on some of those ideas, I can imagine that, this new, articulation around kind of human movements, skill development, its impact on coaching, its impact on athletic development, they could be quite destabilizing and threatening. And obviously, just before Christmas, brilliant timing, we got our Christmas present from someone I've referred, or a group, but one particular I referred to as the academic Grinch, who decided to send through, give a Christmas present of what I thought was a really quite scathing attack of a lot of people in the ecological community, and some really quite wide-ranging criticisms of ecological dynamics as a space. And yeah, and I just found it really quite destabilizing, so much so that it made me write an article about the Grinch. So I just thought that it was like, I mean, we obviously chatted about it, and you guys are called out in it explicitly, and I think there's just some really quite disturbing stuff that was written in there that I think is, to be honest, in my opinion, a bit unbecoming of genuine academics, and also displays some really quite bad misunderstandings of the field. And I also think has some, I think at best, inaccuracies, at worst, outright untruths that have been shared, and some of that is leveled at you guys. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to sort of say, let's get together, and let's just hash it out and start to really talk about it. You guys deserve a right of reply. You've done nothing to deserve the attack that was leveled at you, and I think we ought to sort of maybe just jump into it and then start to just talk about, the rights and wrongs of this kind of approach.
I will certainly start here, Tyler, if I could, by simply saying right off the bat, before we get into the nitty-gritty about what was said and what wasn't said and what was said in other places that maybe they are misrepresenting, is I don't think anyone in the ecological space is shying away from having holes poked at the theory and the ideas. In fact, that's how we all grow. That's how we will all develop. There are certainly, even as Tyler and I has communicated around and about, there were questions raised in the paper that if they would have focused on the questions themselves, we could actually get behind maybe how we have attempted to answer them or the questions that we have circulating. When we run the Movement Academy through Emergence, the students themselves are accustomed to hearing us say certain inadequacies of the theory and of the framework itself. Like, we are very transparent about that. Stu, you yourself at the Sport Movement Skill Conference have been part of some of these discussions where we ourselves are talking about some of the things that we have yet to know. We don't mind that dialogue. We don't mind that commentary and that discussion. In fact, we want to face that head on because we all have a shared passion around understanding more about the emergence of skillful movement behavior in sport. That's what links us together on this side and that side. But the personal attacks and or misrepresentations of what people say is downright, like, that's Bush League where we come from. Like, that's something that you just don't do because it's, number one, unwarranted. Number two, it's really just shows a lack of character and integrity, in my opinion. And this isn't the first time they've come at us. In fact, they've had two pieces where they've had rebuttals and commentaries in regards to papers we've put out, one of which being the Bruce Lee paper, the other one being the American football paper. And I think some of the things that are said there show that they're not actually getting into the details in many of these pieces. They just look for surface level things that they can then attack, that then allows them to hitch their wagon to something else that has momentum. And that's the way this paper in and of itself felt, the one that you're referring to here that was released shortly before Christmas. So we can certainly get into the details a little bit more there. I want to give Tyler an opportunity to say any of his piece, but I guess that's the first thing on top of mind for me as I think about what they've done and where we're at right now.
I echo everything that both of you said, and I also would like to add that I have been quiet for quite some time simply because, as I've mentioned to both of you, I was going to just ignore what was being said because I didn't feel as though it was said with good faith. I really didn't feel as though it was attempting to promote really any coaches within the community because it was simply a barrage at those that would stand for ecological dynamics and the framework and the principles that underpin it. And so I took the stance of, you know what, I'm just going to ignore it because my mom told me to, if I don't have anything nice to say, I shouldn't say anything. And so I was like, I'm just going to kind of hold back. I think it's probably warranted that I in particular, and then obviously Shawn, say something because we have been continually chased by a certain group led by Dave Collins, of course. And I honestly find it a bit comical because, and to your point, Shawn, you said something along the lines of they don't get into the details. It's very evident when you read the paper that they have chosen either due to a lack of laziness or due to laziness or a lack of interest. They have chosen to not really investigate the principles that truly underpin ecological dynamics. And I say that simply because one thing that's always said is that you're just choosing this one way. Well, funny enough, ecological dynamics is underpinned by numerous different scientific domains that have shared interests. So that itself obviously explains one reason why I personally have chosen not to engage because I didn't feel as though it was worth my time, to be honest. And then secondly, and this is going to be probably hard to receive for those that we're speaking to, it's honestly pretty poor writing, to be very honest. The first paper was grossly inaccurate, was just wrong when it came to the actual rules of American football. So I'm like, well, obviously they don't understand the sport. And then lastly, and then I want to admit that while I know I can continually improve as a writer, as a researcher, as a practitioner, I have plenty of areas to improve. The paper was pretty good in helping to showcase what coaches in American football could do if they were wanting to use a contemporary approach and purposely manipulate constraints. And it was shared around quite a bit. And I quite frankly think that the group wanted to latch on to that excitement. And I think they wrote a rebuttal paper just so they could be included within the research. And then lastly, I do feel as though that there's a certain level of laziness. And I feel as though that group in particular, led by Dave, I think they're masquerading as researchers and scientists, but really what they're doing is just attacking the ecological community. And this is coming from a group that's saying that they're, at least to a certain extent, advocates of the approach. I think that's actually stated, like we do agree with some of the ideas. Well, if you agree with some of the ideas, why would you write papers that do nothing but talk about how we're just these awful people and that, oh my goodness, I can't believe that you would stand behind something that you feel as though, based on your experiences and then empirical research, that would be maybe the best fit for the athletes that you partner with. So as I was reflecting on this over Christmas, I thought to myself, I just kept laughing because I thought, we are having stones thrown at us because we stand for something. And what we stand for, we feel as though, because of what we're experiencing and what others have experienced, is a better way to help young movers fall in love with movement, where they have great joy for what they do because it includes them. And then for all movers, it allows for a canvas for them to paint on where they can learn to problem solve and become better athletes. So I thought to myself, like, if someone wants to attack me for that, fantastic, do it. And last but not least here, and I know this is something we're going to get into in particular, and the reason why I decided it was time for me to say something, and why I said that I feel like that their papers have really just adopted this lazy lack of willingness to truly investigate what they're actually citing. I don't want to speak for everyone because I know there were several misrepresentations there. But towards the end of the paper that was recently released, something was said about us misrepresenting or misquoting Bruce Lee. And contorting it in some way to where it would help our argument. And that is absolutely incorrect. Read the paper is what I would like to say to the group that wrote the paper. Read the paper. In particular, read the discarding what is not and why we said what we said. And oh, by the way, if you look at all of what Bruce Lee says, using no way is way, the highest technique is to have no technique. I could keep going. It's evident that he would likely have, we didn't say he did, would likely have embraced ecological ideas. Obviously, the framework wasn't developed until far after he died or long after he died, but likely would have, because almost every other place within his practice, he talked about being adaptable, being water-like. So once again, read the paper. We, and I'll let Shawn expand on this, tweaked one of his quotes saying we discard this particular quote because we feel as though it represents a repetition after repetition. So you're trying to practice a particular technique. We don't stand for that. So we obviously are discarding that, which is part of one of his most famous quotes. And then we would say XYZ, which Shawn will probably read here in a second. So by no means were we doing it to support our argument. We were actually disagreeing with someone that we look to as one that has probably led the way when it comes to pushing against these dogmatic ways of thinking or practicing within either the arts or whatever it may be. So the fact that Myszka et al. Would be included in the paper and it was completely inaccurate was maybe an accident, but I think it was actually purposely done to attack us. And it's just, you should be ashamed of yourself, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, let's just go straight in there. I mean, there's lots we can talk about this, and we'll obviously cover it, but I do think we need to start here. Because I was actually quite surprised, I have to say. So I read that. Now, before we jump into this, we probably ought to just talk about. So as much as I don't really want to increase the visibility of this particular piece of writing, I think people should have a look. So this paper is Ecological Dynamics as an Accurate and Parsimonious Contributor to Applied Practice, a Critical Appraisal, by Collins, Dave Collins, Howie Carson, Per Rylander, and Ray Bobrownicki. Oh, I'm probably not pronounced that properly, but anyway. And as far as I'm aware, Per Rylander for a long time has been an advocate of the old wine in new bottles thing, which we'll come on to later, which is, again, just... Anyway, as far as I'm aware, none of these people describe themselves as pracademics. I'm not sure they are practicing. Any of them are practicing coaches. Some of them might be. I don't know. I certainly know that Dave Collins isn't. And, they're working with coaches and other practitioners, maybe, and all that sort of stuff. And I'm pretty certain, again, I could be corrected here, but I'm pretty certain none of these individuals are active practitioners of ecological dynamics or have ever spent any time or communicated anything publicly about their experiences working as a practitioner with ecological dynamics. So their stance here is coming at it from a theoretical standpoint, as opposed to having any practicing understanding of how anybody would apply any of these ideas. So to actually write a paper from the get-go to talk about an accurate and parsimonious contributor to applied practice, having not really applied the practice, is a really interesting idea as a starting point. And for me, and that's really clear in the paper, that the misunderstandings are very obvious to anybody who's ever used any of these ideas and applied them in principle and wrestled with them. It's very obvious that there is a lot of misunderstandings, which we'll go through and we'll pick them apart. But just to start off with, and like I said, like you guys said, this is not the first time that these so-called opinion pieces have been written. And interestingly, opinion piece for me is interesting because this reads to me, like when you read proper scholarship, right, and you really read it in interesting, you can really tell that this is just like a tabloid hit piece that someone would write. It's just written like that, and it's really, like you say, it's really, I don't think it helps the field at all. I don't think it helps coaching science particularly to be taken seriously. But my bigger fear actually is, and when you see it being published in social media channels and on LinkedIn, you can see some people are taken in by the arguments. They kind of and it's basically in my mind, a form of academic populism, because what they're trying to say is, hey, coaches, it's okay. You can do a bit of everything. It's fine. It's not a problem. Now, I have problem with that because I actually think that's not doing coaches, that's not helping coaches to make informed decisions. Because I'm not bothered which theoretical perspective you come from, you know, as long as you can articulate what your theoretical basis is, and then you can actually say, I'm doing this because these are the things I understand about human learning and all those sorts of things. Really don't care where you're coming from. It's each to their own. But what you can't do is to say, I'm doing a bit of this and a bit of that, because I think, you know, that's the idea for me, because on some occasions, that can be really quite fundamentally dangerous. Anyway, we'll come on to the details of that. Shawn, take us through, you know, because I have to say, I was quite surprised by this. I read it and thought, no, that can't be right. That cannot be right. What they wrote about you guys' research, that cannot be right. There's no way you guys, and knowing the people behind you as supervisors and everybody else, there's no way that would have been that's right. But I have to admit, I went, that's really quite a claim. I'm gonna have to check that out. And so obviously I go to the source material and I'm like, what? Like what they're writing is a direct. Well, they've either deliberately left something out on purpose to make their argument sound a little bit stronger. But anyway, you take it through and really like break this down for us, like why this is so egregious.
Well, and I'll take it verbatim, of course, from the horse's mouth, that which what was published, not only in their paper to start with, but then obviously in rebuttaling for our own. Obviously, within their paper, they said, in this, I quote, as another example, consider the recent paper by Myszka and colleagues, which, some years after the writings and films of the famous martial artist Bruce Lee, actually claimed Lee's views aligned with the ecological dynamics approach, with some direct quotations even altered from his actual statements to fit their argument. Now, if you go to our actual paper, which is part of the problem here, Stu, in that which what I saw circulating around and across social media circles, LinkedIn and the like, that were actually catching on to that which what Collins and crew were saying, attacking us, Myszka et al., Myszka and colleagues, which would obviously be myself, Tyler, and then Keith Davids. And this will get rather long, so I apologize to those who might be listening, but I'm going to read it verbatim because our paper isn't open access, even if you can find it on ResearchGate. So I would implore people to actually go look at the paper. And if you don't have it, reach out to myself, reach out to Tyler. We would be happy to share it. We actually have a section titled Discarding What Is Not. And we go on to say, as an authorship team, we believe we would be amiss if we didn't point out additional concepts and anecdotes related to Bruce Lee that we feel lack empirical evidence or theoretical alignment with an ecological dynamics rationale. Of course, it may be unrealistic to expect Bruce Lee to gravitate entirely towards the adoption of a singular theoretical perspective to pedagogy, especially when he was already challenging so many well-established traditions in martial arts training at the time. The aim for any practitioner is to be in a constant state of refinement, growth, and evolution within one's craft. Thus, in true Bruce Lee fashion, we would like to discard what is not aligned with the ecological dynamics approach from the work of Lee. For starters, one of Bruce Lee's most famous quotes is undoubtedly, "I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times." This comment seemingly takes a stand for the development of technical proficiency, developed through deliberate practice and repetition, maybe even by rote, contradicting many of the ideas shared earlier in the article related to movement variability and repetition without repetition, abundance, and adaptability. Thus, if we were to absorb what is useful and add what is uniquely our own to Lee's words here, we may modify the quote to say, "I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, nor the man who has practiced or one kick 10,000 times, but instead I fear the man who has practiced against 10,000 opponents or practiced solving 10,000 different movement problems." Here, we acknowledge our obvious liberty in proposing these modifications. However, we believe that this modified quote more closely aligns with Bruce Lee's earlier thoughts on JKD, i.e., using no way as the way, the honest and authentic expression of skill, the adjustment of technique execution to the behavior of one's opponent, the aliveness of one's attacks, as well as those oriented in relation to ecological dynamics. So, as you can see, we did change Bruce Lee's quote. However, we were very forthcoming with what we changed about it and why we changed it. And that which what Collins and crew said, which was we did it in order to change and align for our own argument within ecological dynamics. I would hope that the reader, or the listeners in this case, might be able to see that which what we did in a very authentic and transparent fashion and see one of us, one of these groups, as being a little bit more forthcoming about what was said and what wasn't. And I guess that, for me, to Tyler's point, the straw that broke the camel's back, when Bruce Lee, somebody who obviously has shaped my coaching craft, and I are associated together with one another, and they do it in a hit piece or in a hit type of fashion, I actually take major resentment with that. Because obviously we went to great lengths to represent what he does and what he has been in our own craft. And then for someone to portray that we are misleading anyone, I think is just, to your point, I feel like it was a willful misrepresentation of what we said, but it was done very maliciously.
I'd like to add that through the publication process, one of the reviewers, and it was a blind review, so I don't know who it was, had an excellent thought. They said, well, you've talked about all of these ideas from Jeet Kune Do that could be absorbed by other coaches within their craft, and then also by the athletes that are going to be solving problems on the field. And that's one of the main reasons why we wrote the paper, by the way, was to just help influence coaches that might be interested in learning more about it in ecological dynamics rationale, but maybe the language is too challenging. So we were utilizing Jeet Kune Do to draw comparisons so it might be more accessible to coaches. And there are a number of other reasons why we wrote it. But one of the reviewers said, you can't possibly absorb everything from his craft. There has to be something that you would discard. And we're like, that, you know what? That's an excellent point. There are several things that I actually disagree with or would do differently. And so we then added this piece, being very honest about what we feel as though we disagree with and that could potentially be changed in his craft to more appropriately align with what we believe. And so to say the way it was worded in their paper made it sound as though that we said something that he didn't say and said that Bruce Lee said this, by the way, and that he believed this, and you should use ecological dynamics because of it. And that's the part that bothers me, because it was the wordsmith, the one time that it was actually articulated well, in a way that made it sound as though we said something we didn't say. And that's the bush league part. The other thing I'd like to add here, and we were having a conversation with a gentleman yesterday about some of these ideas, not related necessarily to the paper, but about some of these ideas. And he and many others in the Movement Academy would tell you that when people join the Movement Academy through Emergence, we don't try to shove ecological dynamics down their throat. Matter of fact, what we attempt to do is help educate them about what the principles are, what the framework stands for, and then if they outwardly say, I want to know how to use this better within practice, that's where we lean in, we help guide them. We don't go, this is what you do here, this is what you do there, don't do this here, don't do this there. We actually ask questions, we help guide them. And then for those that say, well, how might this work within an information processing approach to skill acquisition? Well, this is XYZ, this is how it might look. We personally don't stand for that, but here are your options. You choose based on what you feel as though fits best for you and your learning environment. It's very apparent that we stand for the ecological dynamics framework. So I wanted to say that on air only because I think it's misunderstood in the community that everyone, and this would include you, Stuart, this would include others, everyone that adopts an ecological dynamics framework just completely what's on anything to do with a different approach. We may stand for ours and we may say that this has worked for us, but to your point earlier, Stuart, every coach is likely well-intended with what they're attempting to do in their learning environment. And so when those come to us, typically it's just to learn more about what is so contemporary about this and how might it differ from what I'm currently doing. And oftentimes they're saying, I would like to learn more about it because I've heard that it works for many. What might I absorb? And so we then share it with them. We don't say, you're an idiot, you're doing everything wrong. That actually would be completely misaligned with an ecological way of coaching coaches. So I'm bamboozled, quite frankly, by the peer review process to publish something that asks some good questions, by the way. There were some good questions asked in the paper. And to your point earlier, Stuart, go read the paper. There are some good questions that are asked, some of which have already been answered, some of which have been asked in other areas, and we noticed that they didn't quote any of those papers. But then there are numerous things that are just an attack to try to cause this divide between those that want to just choose whatever, whenever, whatever suits their fancy and call it, oh, this is what's good for the athlete. And then those that might embrace an ecological dynamics approach. And if there was true alignment or some type of convergence where those that wrote the paper would want to embrace some of the ecological ideas, why wouldn't you just write a paper that says, we would like to learn more about X, Y, Z. We feel as though there could be some more research done in this area, end of story. And I don't remember the exact name of the paper, and I may or may not have been one that reviewed it. I didn't love the paper, but it was much better written in the fact that it just basically asked questions and bringing more color or something to a constraints-led approach. That, to me, is how you would write a paper that would be a scientific peer-reviewed journal article that would call into question some of what could be done in order to further the ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, I think everything, obviously I take everything you said there is absolutely dead on. My biggest issue, I suppose, is why would, in order to, the point they're trying to make, actually the section in the paper where they're talking about this is this idea that ecological dynamics isn't anything new. This notion of old wine in new bottles, or it's just been packaged as ecological dynamics innovations. And actually, this is stuff that's been done for years. So actually, don't be taken in by it. Actually, most, and the argument they make is that very often traditional approaches or cognitively derived approaches and all those sorts of things are, we in the ecological community, we're creating a false straw man that actually isn't the reality of practice. So actually there's, it's not all really extreme rote repetition and all these sorts of things. The reality is that that's that the reality of most coaching practice actually embraces much more of the ideas that ecological practitioners would argue are their own, so to speak, or ecologically derived or whatever it might be. And so in actual fact, you have to take that into account. Now, I think you guys would, and in fact, you guys do a great job of this, right? Because you will regularly point to examples in elite sport where actually very extreme approaches, rote repetition, decontextualized practice, people, who are elite practitioners bouncing around through hoops and ladders and all this stuff that has only ever been derived from this particular idea around the way movements and skilled movement emerges in this linear tradition of technique towards skill, right? That is still so prevalent that one of the things that the ecological practitioner or theorist would say is, can we question this usage? And you question the usage because you say, look, if you believe or understand something about human adaptation throughout history, and you understand that through an ecological lens, that looks like complete nonsense, right? It looks like, it doesn't make sense at all. You would never do that as an ecological practitioner, because you just know full well that it's at best a waste of time, or not necessarily a waste of time, but just not going to have the benefit that people look for. Now, I'm just going to stress this. It's not to say it doesn't have any benefit necessarily, right? Because it does get you better at that movement. And if getting better at that movement is important, fine. The problem is people want to make this claim that it's going to transfer. It's valuable because it's going to transfer. And now there is very poor evidence for that. Very poor evidence across the whole of coaching science and skill acquisition science, right? So this notion of transfer is a major issue, right? But this idea that if you develop an underlying technique, it will therefore be better to be able to transfer, that's sort of almost just taken as an understanding. So whenever someone does that, it's never questioned. Any ecological community does question it because we think of skilled movement differently, right? Now, that's not to say that we're painting it as a straw man. We're not. We're saying, look, there are very, very good examples of practice that exist in elite sport all the time, and community sport for that matter, because community sport copies elite sport. They see what they're doing and they think, that's good, we'll do this here. So it becomes very, very self-fulfilling, and it's never questioned. And the minute an ecological practitioner or theorist questions that practice, the criticism is, you're painting that as a straw man. We're not. We're saying there's an alternative explanation of skilled movement, that if you understand that, you have to question the value of that particular practice. It's not critical of the individual necessarily, it's critical of the practice. So that's the section and the argument they're making. And in that argument, they chose to pick out your paper talking about how many of the practices and public articulations around movement that Bruce Lee was like famously talked about, and the idea of Jeet Kune Do, and the idea of, no way is the way and be like water and all these sorts of things, there are parallels to the way an ecological practitioner or theorist would think about movement. Now, that's not to try and claim that Bruce Lee was actually an ecological dynamicist, right? Because it's very unlikely that he necessarily had a lot of understanding of this stuff. However, he was actively pushing against, and this is what I learned from your paper, pushing against many of the very rigid martial art forms that had emerged as Eastern martial arts became westernized and productized and all those sorts of things. He actually pushed against that because he was questioning the validity of those ideas when it came to becoming a genuinely adaptable martial artist. And there are direct parallels. But in that bit, so they're saying that people have done this for years. Look, Bruce Lee did, right? But then turn that round and at the same time just make this like absolutely scathing attack on that piece of work, by basically trying to discredit the whole thing by basically saying these authors tried to manipulate a quote to satisfy their argument when you did the exact opposite. You pointed to your own some of the own inadequacies or the inconsistencies, because he didn't say everything that was like that. He said things that were directly in contradiction to that sort of thing. And you actually said, yes, we point to that and say, actually, there are some gaps in the understanding. We're not claiming that he was an ecological dynamicist. We're just claiming that many of the things he said were very similar to the kinds of things an ecological dynamicist would talk about now. And you would then to try and claim that you deliberately altered a quote to make your point, when in actual fact you did the exact opposite of that. You quoted exactly verbatim, and then you said, had he had a different kind of understanding of ecological dynamics, he might have said something along these lines, right? It's a totally different thing. So that claim they're making in a desperate attempt to discredit the work, which is like, that is the worst kind, in my opinion. Like that is the worst kind of, I don't know what you could call it in the world of academia. But to do that, like deliberately. And this same author, by the way, this lead author, Dave Collins, in the past, having written papers with titles like Talent Needs Trauma, and when he's been criticized for writing those kinds of papers, and people have said, has gone absolutely ballistic at anybody who he claimed was misrepresenting his work. We didn't mean that when we wrote that title. That's not what we meant. You know that's what we meant. If you read the paper, it means something else. But so if you're going to take that stance to say, do not dare misrepresent me, why then go and do something like this? It's the worst kind of hypocrisy.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And at the end of the day, and I'm an individual that is somewhat early in my research career, having been a practitioner for my entire life. I still act as an actual practitioner, working with athletes on the field and in the weight room to help develop their abilities. But then rather early in my research career, and I knew early on, because I have some very good mentors that said, it can get a bit dicey sometimes. People do some odd things. They attack what you may say, especially because it may challenge some of what they do. I didn't expect this. I expected people to provide a citation for something that they stand for that may differ with regard to what I have said compared to what they may do. I didn't expect someone to misrepresent purposely what we said to fit their argument and support the do whatever you want whenever you want approach. And I think the nice thing about being an it depends person is you can always be right if you align with everything whenever. And then you can position we're doing it for what's best for the athlete. And to a point you made earlier, Stu, and one of the reasons why I actually elected to primarily or almost exclusively in 2016, and then obviously all the way in now, embrace nonlinear pedagogical ideas and I've had numerous athletes say something like this. I had an athlete I was working with, and at this time I was a technical proficiency in the warm-up and the linear speed work, but then we would go to these open agility activities, and I was encouraging exploration. I was changing the problem-solving space size. There was different interpersonal distances that were changing to begin the activity. There were different numerical relations. Like I was attempting to purposely manipulate constraints to develop his ability to secure the ball and catch it and elude defenders. And we were transitioning from an area where I was telling him exactly how to move, what he was doing wrong, how he could change it, just copious instructions. And then we would go from there over to the problem-solving area where I was encouraging exploration. And he goes, bro, which one do you want me to do? I'm literally like freezing up as I'm moving into this next activity because I don't even know what you want me to do. And I realized at that time, this is actually detrimental if it's no, do this, this is wrong, or if this, then that here. And then over here, I'm like, I want you to I encourage you to explore different ways of solving the problem. And I also would like to take this time to say there are others out there, and I'm not necessarily saying those that wrote this paper that, well, they're just letting them self-organize in any way. No, there can be functional self-organization and non-functional because it's continually not solving the problem. So ecological practitioners are criticized for just completely being hands-off and standing back and just letting them figure it out. And there are times where when you're working with youth, I want there to be pure exploration. I want them to roll and tumble and fall and learn to move, to borrow from Adolf and Hock and their ideas. But as an ecological practitioner, you have to be very much invested in the session, purposely manipulating constraints based on what is unfolding, not just following a book of drills and a script. You actually have to make purposeful changes in order to facilitate the emergence of skill. And that is difficult to do, which is often why probably coaches will elect to just going back to yelling and screaming, even though they may have good intentions. So I say all of this to say, there are so many things that are misunderstood, and we're here. Reach out to us. We're happy to have a conversation with you. I may seem like I'm an abrasive individual, but I'm actually not. I want the same thing you do, more than likely. I want my athletes to fall in love with movement in order to continually move throughout their lifespan, and I want them to perform more successfully whenever they're in competition. I would imagine that's what you want. So with that said, if I have a coach that comes to me, and this has happened before, where a coach has an athlete who his eyes are glued to the ground. They've got a football in their hand. Other coaches are slapping them with pool noodles, and the lead coach is spraying them with a water hose as they dance around cones, which, by the way, is still done. And I might say, Coach, out of curiosity, what are you attempting to accomplish here? Well, I want them to have to be able to use good footwork in challenging situations where the ball might be wet and they're getting hit by opponents. Oh, okay. Well, that's actually what I want as well. Out of curiosity, could you just wet the ball, or maybe schedule a practice for a time that the field's going to be wet, so you actually have those same conditions, but maybe you have a resisting opponent that's kind of grabbing and pulling at the ball, which might cause that running back to have to spin, and then you have another defender that's in front of them. They have to elude that individual in order to get good at solving those problems. Oh yeah, I could do that. Oh, okay, great. We're after the same thing. So my point is I'm not saying that their intentions are terrible. The way in which it's approaching what they're wanting to do just doesn't have any merit. So my point is as an ecological coach developer, all I'm attempting to do is help them better understand the fundamental principles that underpin nonlinear pedagogy and an ecological dynamics approach, so they can more effectively use them in practice, so we can accomplish the goal of helping develop a better mover.
I don't even know where to jump in here on the many golden nuggets that both of y'all put down in various mic drops. I think to Tyler's final point that he was making there is we do want the same things. And I think that's the thing that people need to recognize and remember, in that, I mean, as Tyler and I have talked about numerous times, our second ever Sport Movement Skill Conference, we brought people from both sides of the fence or both sides of the bridge. Our theme was around cohesion and convergence, trying to be inspired by Keith's paper that he wrote in 2005 with Anson and Elliott around an information processing approach and a constraints-led approach, and were they divergent or were they complementary? And I think at that time, it's become clear as to what we're actually saying when we are investigating skillful movement behavior in sport. That if you do adopt an ecological frame and scope of analysis, the only relevant scope of analysis there is on the performer-environment relationship and the mutual reciprocal nature of it. So for them to even say, we believe and agree with some aspects of ecological dynamics, but then they'll go to drilling and the like, and some of the things that isolate and decontextualize the performer-environment relationship and attempt to water down the coupling that would exist there. Like, the main key tenet or tenets of the approach that you are proclaiming has efficacy in certain ways, you're violating one of the main key aspects of the approach, or the relations that would exist between perceptions, cognitions, and actions. Notice I actually pointed out cognitions there, just as our 2023 paper did, and highlighted the intertwined, interwoven nature between perceptions, cognitions, and actions. Yet they have an entire section in the paper around cognition and intentions and say no one in ecological dynamics is talking about this. Ironically, that's one of the papers they haven't intended to attack or include on this hit piece paper. That one's very, very well researched, I guess, by them, because they were in the same journal. They were in that Frontiers episode and issue. Ours just so happens to have 16,000 views, and theirs just so happens to have like 2. But hey, it's ironic that they didn't select that one to feature when they had their entire section, because it would have wiped their section out. And so they're cherry picking. So to accuse us of being straw man arguments or having straw man arguments, I think is rather ripe and rich, when they're doing the exact same thing on their end. And to your point that you made earlier, a bit hypocritical more often than not, because again, not only our work has done that with positioning, cognition, and intentions in that way in place, but also DeWart's work, Turvey's work. I mean, there's plenty of work there that if they were to really dive into it, but again, remember what I mentioned earlier, they hit the surface level so they can make these arguments to the people that probably aren't going to dive any deeper And that's the unfortunate part, because there's a big contingent of people who are looking for something better. They're looking for more answers. They're looking to find more of the truth. I'm not saying that truth completely exists over here in ecological dynamics and the adoption of this framework. But what we are saying is like it's misleading and misguiding some very well-intentioned people that are searching for answers, and then they find those places where they're like, oh yeah, those ecological dynamics junkies, they only want to be snake oil salesmen. Like I literally had that said about me on LinkedIn after this piece came out. Like to position someone who's obviously going out working with athletes, locking arms with them, caring about their improvement, and mind you, as I've talked about many times throughout the years, once adopted a very traditionally minded way of acquiring skill in the athletes I worked with. And I forego it because of coming into these ideas and finding more efficacy there. Not having all the answers, not having all of the truth, but feeling I was getting closer, and the athletes feeling the difference when and where it counts, which is on a field on a Sunday, which is what they get paid to do in my case. And so to say that, oh, these hypotheses aren't tested, they're not testing them, we're only putting out these case studies. Yeah, I'm putting out case studies because guess what, research group? I am out there working in the field. I am out there practicing these ideas. So I don't have time to sit around and write research piece after research piece or conduct this study or craft that. That's not what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
And
no, I mean, you make a good point. You make a really good point, Shawn. I this is my issue is it's the dishonesty. So anybody talk about snake oil, right? I genuinely believe this to be just a craven attempt, because I noticed there's a book coming out. Collins has authored a book that's going to actually embrace ecological dynamics. It's actually bringing it into and trying to craft it onto the sort of cognitive approach. And now that has to be because, as they rightly say in this paper, there are some things about ecological dynamics that they believe to be good. They just don't believe that it's the only way, in their own phrase. And look, nobody has said it's the only way. Some people have said, and I've said this, it's the only way for me, because the more I begin to understand of this, the more I realize how misguided my previous practice was. So again, all three of us have all been established practitioners using more traditional, cognitively derived approaches, and we've all rejected them. And the reason we've rejected them is because fundamental theoretical premise upon which those practices were based, we believe to be flawed. We believe there is a better explanation that was originally conceived many years ago, and as now as coaching science has improved, as our understanding of the way people are beginning to move, as more empirical evidence emerges, as analytics starts to bring us down, as more stuff we get to see through video, we're beginning to see that this alternative explanation has way more promise. Is it in any way like rock solid and fundamentally proven? No, there's still plenty of questions to answer, as there would be in any field. There are still plenty of questions to be answered in the cognitive field, but it's almost like we're taking that as read, like it's established science. Well, I'm sorry, there is a big replication problem in psychology, and many of the findings that they've got in those areas are open to a lot of question, right? And any field should always be emerging anyway. But like the ecological approach is being cast as this woo-woo, you're making these over claims about, you can't back up with your science and all these sorts of things. Everyone I know in the industry is very honest about that. We know that we haven't got all the answers. We know that the empirical evidence, there are some areas where the empirical evidence, but the reason most people are bought into this idea is because they understand that there is a significant amount of promise in the approach. And we're so we're so jaded by our previous experiences that we believe there is actually more to be gained by leaning into the grey, to be ironic, into the grey, leaning in to the areas where we don't understand, right? And finding out more as practitioners and being right on the cutting edge of that, and what you're doing is you're taking your field work and then now applying it in genuine research to apply to move it further forward, to actually build the research and build the basis upon which the whole area can be developed. Now, in my opinion, what I think I see in here in this critical paper is a desperate attempt to say to coaches, most of whom aren't going to be as versed in the theory as you guys are, to say to them, it's all right. Don't worry about it. You don't have to worry about all this stuff. You can carry on doing what you've always been doing. You can take a bit of this new stuff because it sounds quite interesting, but you have to let go of everything else before you're okay, right? Now, they are lying to you, right? You can't have your theoretical cake and eat it, right? If you believe in the ideas of ecological psychology, the ideas of ecological dynamics, and you understand that this is a re-articulation of the way humans learn and develop, to then go, so to say, well, the way humans learn and develop is because there is information present in an environment. And actually, if we can use constraints as a mechanism by which to draw attention to some of those areas in the search space and guide learning using constraints, because it's not just let them at it, it's self-organization under constraints, right? And you use constraints effectively to enable people to pay attention to relevant information sources. And those information sources then guide their movement, right? If you believe in that, and then go, I want you to do this repetitive technique drill, right? You are just fundamentally doing two entirely separate things. And anybody who suggests to you that you can combine the two and you would be a pragmatic and parsimonious individual by doing so is lying to you. I'm sorry. I wish it weren't the case. I wish there were parts of this I could graft on myself because it would make my life easier. But it's not the way it is. I'm sorry. It's an inconvenient truth. So to go out there and say, by the way, lads, you can be a vegan and have the odd bacon sandwich. I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that.
Oh man, that's probably a great way to finish this episode here. I think at the end of the day, I enjoy having conversations the most with friends of mine who actually align with a completely different approach and stand behind that because they can say, no, I want to repeat the same technique because if I make that technique perfect, then there can be a representation stored somewhere or a set of motor commands and they can pull that out and they can execute that action whenever. I'd rather have a conversation with someone that completely disagrees with me on the opposite side, but can stand for it and say, no, this is why I'm doing the practice in the way that I'm doing it versus it being, I'm going to do both whenever I want to do it. And that just doesn't even make sense to me. So I appreciate you having us on. And I understand as an authorship team and those that are involved with the group, the Dave Collins Gray Matters group, I understand that obviously this is irritating to hear, but it's just don't throw stones at people that are not throwing stones back at you. I'm just trying to advance the field. I'm trying to work with practitioners that are keen to learn more about how do you purposely manipulate constraints. Oh, well, come to find out, here are some papers that are applying the ideas within practice. I make tons of mistakes. There are plenty of questions that need to be answered to your point, Stu, but it's like, I'm trying to do me over here and you're trying to do you and vice versa. And then you've got a group over here that wants to throw stones at people that are just trying to advance the field. And so that part I just don't understand. So I'm going to continually do me. And the reason why I haven't written any rebuttal papers, I mentioned a couple of reasons early on in the podcast episode here, but the reason why is because then I would be taking time away from advancing an ecological approach and showcasing how the ideas could exist within practice, finding out mistakes that I'm making so I can further advance those that are interested in applying the ideas. Because at the end of the day, I am not the brightest person. I'm not the best researcher out there. I'm not the best practitioner, but I'm pretty good at both. And if I can find a spot that allows for me to help those that are interested in using the ideas, actually having the ability to put them into practice, which I think is what we're trying to do. If I can help, well, then that's what I want to do. And I'm not going to take any more time away than this particular episode right here to give attention to a group that I feel as though is trying to tear down those that are actually trying to help coaches.
Well, and even then on that note, I mean, Stu, obviously for years you have invited them to have a conversation on your podcast. And the excuse that we always hear is, oh, it will be biased. If we can find someone who's neutral. Well, tell me where it is that this neutral individual in the space actually exists. The person that they would hand select that would bring us all together. I mean, it's their cop-out way of not actually having these types of interactions and instead hiding behind the keyboard and maybe a research journal paywall in some of these cases, or their university funding in order to pay for said paper to be published. And I think it's that, like, that shows the disingenuous nature of that, which I've seen you publicly ask to have a conversation with them, and yet they all run for the hills, just as we did in 2019 at the Sport Movement Skill Conference, inviting people from that side to come and have conversations, to pull up a seat at the table and to actually interact around what are these supposed shortcomings, but also what is it that you agree with and why, and to actually just start piecing it out and to discuss it like with a certain degree of human character. I think is really maybe the call to action here, to not actually represent something untruthfully, to not try to mislead or misguide someone who might have good intentions, but instead to actually lock arms around what we all want, which is influencing and impacting sport coaching practices across the world so our athletes can become more skillful. At least that's what I want, and I'm at least assuming that is what many of the individuals who got into researching sports science to begin with had as their intentions as well. And so I guess I think there's so much that can be taken from that, which what we're saying here today. And I'm hoping that even if any of them have gotten to that point where they've listened this deep and this far into it, which I know is asking a lot because they haven't done that actually with our papers before they attack them, that if they want to come back with some sort of counterattack, they actually pull up with a sincere attempt at actually having interactions and having a mutual reciprocal engagement around it.
Yeah, I mean, so that I'm glad you made that point because I was going to say that myself. Yeah, there's been several attempts. I don't know what he's afraid of. You know, I'm not a career academic. I'm not going to be able to lift quotes from papers from wherever, right? I'd probably have considerable, reputational risk for me to invite somebody like that onto my podcast for a conversation. We could quite easily, pull it apart. So I don't know what the fear is. But I have to say, if you're somebody who, as you purport in your papers, and this one's another one, if you purport that you're only interested in advancing coaching science and providing coaches with, kind of quality and accurate information to be able to help them develop and make informed decisions so they can use their professional judgment, if that's your interest, surely you would want this stuff to be more publicly accessible and in a format that coaches are more likely to take on board, or skill acquisition specialists are more likely to take on board. And also, it's the way of us advancing the conversation. We could have a decent conversation that actually talks about where are the gaps, where are the limitations. Now, the only reason that you could possibly be afraid of coming on and having like an open conversation is if you're not acting in good faith. It's the only reason. And that's the only thing, that's the only conclusion I can come to, because I keep making the offer. I keep having it rejected. I keep being told I should write a peer-reviewed rebuttal paper. This isn't science. This isn't how we evolve things. This isn't how we progress things. We can we could have conversations, because plenty of researchers have been on, like you guys and lots of others have come on only too interested in sharing their work to help it reach a broader audience. And to hide behind peer review and all this sort of stuff while you just, I mean, we haven't even touched on, it could be a 5-hour podcast if we started to unpick everything in this, but trust me, I will get there. I will pick apart episode by episode, I will pick apart various aspects of this particular paper to just show how, how dishonest it is. And he probably isn't going to come on now because I have done this, but still, he had his chance. So unfortunately, you want to, if you don't want to come on and talk about it and defend your own scholarship, that's fine. I'm just going to I'm going to actually take the people you have a pot shot at and bring them on so they can defend theirs, particularly when the attack is, a wanton misrepresentation of the truth. Anyway, it's New Year's Eve. We should wrap up. Guys, really appreciate you coming on. I'm going to quickly ask you before we wrap up. What are your hopes for 2025? You don't have to make any New Year's resolutions that you won't be held to. I should make some public New Year's resolutions, to be fair, but anyway, I probably won't. What are you looking forward to in the next year? What are your hopes?
I'll start here. I'm looking forward to spending more time with my family now that I have a little bit more time back. That's number one. Number two, investing even more so in my own health. Not that I was neglecting it by any means the past 4 to 5 years, but probably not putting as much time into it as I needed. Number three, I have a number of publications, both peer-reviewed journal article and book form that are coming out in 2025. One should probably be in the first 2 weeks. It's already been accepted, so excited about that. And then last but not least, it's interesting because we do have some exciting new adventures within not only the Sport Movement Skill Conference and Emergence, but I think just as an ecological community, I think there are some great things that are happening, and we're going to continue to lock arms and help coaches in any way that we can and learn ourselves. And so I'm excited to spend time with family, learn, help educate others. So it's going to be a good 2025, that's for sure.
And I will put it out there to the universe in hope of manifesting it that we will see 2025 be the year that many more in high performance sports organizations begin to employ and bring on skill acquisition specialists to be part of what they're doing within their organization, to maybe begin to guide more of the learning objectives, to be able to actually set forth organizational strategies around practice design, to be able to bridge of many other departments, and to, obviously kind of steal from our own thunder here ourselves, along with Fabi Ott from our 2024 paper here, one that we are quite proud of, the role of the skill acquisition specialist, that we feel as though we're on the precipice of something big within and across the skill acquisition community. And that, again, isn't just about being an ecological dynamics practitioner. It's about practitioners in skill acquisition getting a space at the table, and actually here in America, seeing that be more of the norm, just like it would be with sports psychology or sports science or nutrition or strength and conditioning and the like, actually having skill acquisition have a voice in high performance sports organization. That's sort of my New Year's resolution, but more so my manifestation and my expectation for the greater universe.
So I didn't mention that because I knew that was what Shawn was going to say, but now that he has said it, that's also what I'm wanting for 2025. I know a lot of organizations are close, or they're creating a partial position. I won't name names, but there are some professional teams that are starting to do it. There are some individuals that are working in part-time roles. There are individuals that are curious to learn more, but I mean, if we rewind back probably several decades at least, strength and conditioning, why would I have a strength and conditioning coach? So-and-so has weight trained before. We'll just have them do it. Well, they don't have a background in it. They don't understand the science. Well, now we see those roles across different organizations. I use that as just a singular example. So I think it's going to be, and to Bobby's point that he made on social media a couple of weeks ago, it's only going to be a few years. I'm hoping it's only one, but a few years before every single team will have one or more on staff that can ask questions about the practice design, that can help in the recruiting process, that can help in the drafting process, that can help in the sports medicine area, the strength and conditioning area. That way there's more alignment. Think about it as like the fascia that runs through the human body. That way there's just more alignment. You have a department of methodology maybe, and you have shared principles that are being used across a team. I mean, that to me seems like the best idea. In order to get there, we're going to have some ask questions about maybe what they're doing and why they're doing it. And it can't just be because I want to, and this is what so-and-so did, and I'm just copying it. Or I was a player myself, and I'm just going to do this drill because I like it. Like there has to actually be true meaning behind what's being done. And if this particular part of the podcast episode ever gets out there and any decision makers are hearing it, you have to go all in to do it. You can't bring someone on board and then not give them a seat at the table and expect that great change is going to happen. So I'm excited for that to happen this 2025.
Awesome. So from my perspective, just to sort of build on that a little, my, I guess, pledge, manifestation, whatever it is that if there is a silver lining to this particular piece of writing, it's that it's prompted something that I think many of us have been thinking and talking about for quite some time, which is it's time for the ecological community to actually start to have a much stronger voice. And so my thing I'm looking forward to is actually having more opportunities for the ecological community to get together, more opportunities for the ecological community to begin to do some shared projects and working together, more opportunities for us to put more content out and to amplify that content. So if anything, it's had a galvanizing effect. And I think what people will begin to see is that the ecological community, I think, has got a genuine right to exist and a right to say what it says. And I think there are a lot of interesting things that would be genuinely helpful to practitioners. This kind of stuff isn't helpful. And one of the things that I'm driven by, and one of the reasons I'm so much of an advocate, and I'm accused of being evangelical, guilty as charged. Why? Because this has got so much benefit for athlete, practitioner alike. And so I'm really passionate to be able to get that community. So I'm going to be helping others to amplify. I'm going to be helping to generate more content, flood the zone, as they say, and help more people to really start to begin to go on this learning journey. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting 2025. And by the way, if stuff like this comes out again, I'm not going to be afraid to point out where its flaws are. And if you're a genuinely serious practitioner who's genuinely serious about your craft, buying into this sort of stuff is not going to get you very far. So, guys, I'm looking. I wish you all the best. I hope you have a good evening, whatever it is you get up to. And I look forward to an exciting 2025.
Thank you, my friend. We appreciate you.